In a quaint, rural setting, 2 hours by car from my father's home, stood his ancestral farmhouse. I always had a fondness for that rustic charm, and as a high schooler, when I began riding my bike, I'd often visit alone during summer and winter breaks. My grandparents always greeted me with joyous warmth. But it's been over a decade since my last visit. It wasn't that I chose not to go. Rather, I couldn't. And here's why. It was early spring, just as the break began. Lured by the splendid weather, I rode my bike to my grandparents' house. Though still chilly, the veranda basked in a cozy warmth. As I relaxed there, a strange sound reached my ears. Po-po, po-po, po-po. It wasn't mechanical, more like someone was making the noise. It seemed to fluctuate between a muffled and a half-muted tone. Curious, I noticed a hat atop the garden hedge. It wasn't just placed there. As the hat moved sideways along the hedge, it reached a gap, and then I saw her. A woman in a pale dress. The hedge was about 2 meters tall. How could a woman be tall enough to peer over it? While I pondered, she and the hat vanished, and the po-po-po sound ceased. At first, I thought maybe it was a tall woman in high boots, or a tall man in heels, cross-dressing. Later, in the living room over tea, I mentioned this to my grandparents. There was this tall woman, or maybe a man in drag, I said casually. They didn't react much until I added, she was taller than the hedge, wearing a hat, making a weird po-po sound. Suddenly they froze, completely still. They bombarded me with questions. When and where I saw her, how tall she was. My grandfather, with a stern face, pressed for answers. After my response, he silently went to make a phone call, leaving us behind the closed sliding doors. Grandmother seemed visibly shaken. Grandfather returned and said, "Stay the night. You can't go back now." I was puzzled, unable to recall any wrongdoing on my part. It was the woman who appeared to me, not the other way around. "Grandma, what's happening?" I asked timidly. "You've been ensnared by the 8 feet lady," she replied with a trembling voice. "Grandpa will handle it, don't worry." She then shared the local lore. In this region, there's an entity known as the 8 feet lady. She's an unusually tall woman, about 2.42 meters, often seen laughing in a deep, unsettling manner. People perceive her differently, sometimes as a young woman in mourning clothes, an elderly lady in traditional wear, or a middle-aged woman in casual dress. The common traits are her height, something on her head, and her eerie laugh. There were rumors of her following travelers, but it's unclear. She's bound to this area, sealed by a Jizo statue, unable to leave. Those who attract her attention usually perish within days. The last known incident was about 15 years ago. I later learned that the Jizo statues are placed at the boundaries in all 4 directions to prevent her movement. Apparently, this arrangement was part of an old agreement with neighboring villages, possibly related to water rights. The legend of the 8 feet lady, it seems, only brings misfortune every few years. Perhaps the villagers of old thought it a small price to pay for a favorable agreement. The story felt unreal to me, something out of a folk tale. In the midst of these thoughts, my grandfather returned with an elderly woman named Mrs. A. She handed me a talisman and said gravely, "This is a serious matter. Hold on to this." Then she and my grandfather went upstairs, doing something I couldn't see. Grandma stayed with me constantly, even accompanying me to the bathroom, not allowing the door to close fully. It was then that the gravity of the situation truly hit me. Soon I was ushered to a room upstairs. The windows were covered with newspaper, talismans plastered over them, and salt was placed in each corner. There was a makeshift shrine with a small Buddha statue, and curiously, 2 children's potty training seats. "Night is falling," my grandfather said, his face stern and serious like I'd never seen before. "Do not leave this room until 7 a.m. tomorrow. We won't call you or respond if you call us. Do not open this door until then, but leave at exactly 7 a.m. I'll notify your family." Mrs. A added, "Follow these instructions carefully. Keep the talisman with you at all times and pray to the Buddha if anything happens." I turned on the TV for some distraction, but couldn't focus. I didn't even touch the snacks and rice balls Grandma gave me, just curled up in the futon, shaking with fear. I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to a late-night show, my watch showing just past 1 a.m. As I lay there, a tapping sound came from the window. It wasn't like stones being thrown. It was softer, like fingers. I tried convincing myself it was just the wind, but this was the second floor. Frightened, I turned up the TV volume to drown out the sound. Then I heard my grandfather's voice outside the door. "Hey, are you okay? You don't have to be scared." I nearly approached the door, but then remembered his warning. The voice continued, coaxing me, but it wasn't his voice. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I did, and goosebumps covered my skin. Looking at the corner salt, I saw it had turned black. I rushed to the Buddha statue, clutching the talisman, praying fervently for help. Then came that sound again, po-po-po, accompanied by the tapping on the window. Though I knew she couldn't be tall enough to reach, I imagined her stretching up to tap the glass. All I could do was pray. It felt like the longest night, but eventually morning came. The TV left on now showed the morning news. It was 7:13 a.m. The tapping and the voice had stopped. I must have passed out or fallen asleep without realizing it. The salt in the corners had turned even blacker. I checked my watch. It was indeed past 7 a.m. Trembling, I opened the door to find my grandmother and Mrs. A, their faces etched with concern. Grandma was in tears, relieved. Downstairs, my father was there too. Grandpa peeked in from outside, urging me to hurry to the car. In the yard, a van awaited, and several men were gathered around. In the 9-seater van, I was seated in the middle, surrounded by the men from the yard, including Mrs. A. We formed a protective circle, 9 in total. "Keep your eyes closed and look down," the man next to me, around 50 years old, instructed. "You might see something we can't. Don't open your eyes until we say it's safe." The convoy, led by my grandfather's truck, followed by our van, and trailed by my father's car, moved slowly, probably not exceeding 20 kilometers per hour. Mrs. A started chanting something like a prayer. Then I heard it again. Po-po-po! I clutched the talisman, eyes shut, facing downwards. But I couldn't resist partially opening my eyes. I saw a white dress moving alongside the car. The figure seemed to be trying to peek inside, her head lowering towards the window. I gasped in fear. "Don't look!" the man beside me shouted. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the talisman tighter. Tap, tap, tap! The sound on the glass began. Everyone in the van reacted subtly, indicating they could hear it too. Mrs. A's prayers intensified. Finally, the sounds ceased. "We made it," Mrs. A announced. Relief washed over everyone. We stopped at a wider part of the road, and I was transferred to my father's car. As my father and grandfather thanked the men, Mrs. A inspected the talisman, now darkened. She handed me a new one. "Just to be safe, keep this for a while." I returned home with my father. He shared that as a child, one of his friends was taken by the 8-feet lady, and he knew others who had to move away because of her. The men in the van were distant relatives, part of our extended family. The whole convoy was a desperate attempt to deceive the 8-feet lady, using our bloodline connection. That night, the worst-case scenario was my father or grandfather becoming a substitute sacrifice. Later, my grandmother called with chilling news. Someone destroyed the Jizo statue, sealing the 8-feet lady, the one near your house. I felt a cold shiver remembering that night. The victims of the 8-feet lady are often young, probably because they are more likely to trust a familiar voice in a state of extreme anxiety. 10 years have passed since then, and I've almost forgotten about that night. But the thought of hearing that po-po-po again fills me with dread.